Hey guys, welcome back, or welcome in if this is your first time here. Tonight, there's nothing you need to do. No lessons to memorize, no life advice to actually follow. Just dim the lights, put your phone down somewhere nearby, and let your brain slowly clock out for the evening. Because tonight, we're drifting into something calm, a little strange, and quietly uncomfortable. We're talking about how humans reveal who they are without ever meaning to. And guiding us through this sleepy psychological walk is everyone's favorite philosophical troublemaker, Friedrich Nietzsche. Which is funny because Nietzsche spent most of his life deeply misunderstood, chronically ill, and increasingly annoyed at basically everyone. But somehow, he was incredibly good at reading people. Not in a psychic way, more in a I've watched humans ruin themselves long enough to see the patterns kind of way. Nietzsche didn't write psychology textbooks. He wrote observations, short, sharp thoughts about ego, insecurity, power, fear, and the quiet lies people tell themselves so they can sleep at night. Which is ironic, because that's exactly what we're doing now. So, let's begin gently. One of Nietzsche's simplest truths is also one of the most uncomfortable. People rarely act from logic. They act from emotion, and then recruit logic afterward to defend what they already wanted. You can see this everywhere, in royal courts, in politics, in families, in arguments that begin with, "I'm not emotional about this, but..." Whenever someone starts explaining why they did something in excessive detail, Nietzsche would tell you to stop listening to the words and start watching the motivation. Because the longer the explanation, the more likely it's hiding insecurity. Confidence is quiet. Insecurity narrates. Kings who felt secure didn't need long speeches. They simply ruled. But the insecure ones, the ones born with weak claims, questionable bloodlines, or very obvious physical defects, they talked endlessly. They justified, they blamed advisors, they wrote letters explaining themselves. Nietzsche noticed that humans don't fear being wrong, they fear being seen as wrong. Which is why people double down, because admitting error feels like social death. And if you ever want to read someone instantly, watch how they respond when they're gently corrected. Do they pause, reflect, or do they rush to defend themselves as if you just attacked their entire identity? Because for many people, being wrong feels the same as being worthless. And Nietzsche found that tragic, but also predictable. Another quiet truth. People reveal their self-worth by what they tolerate. This one played out beautifully in royal marriages. Queens who endured humiliation, princes who accepted neglect, kings who allowed advisors to openly disrespect them. Not because they were noble, but because deep down they believed that was all they deserved. Nietzsche believed resentment was more dangerous than anger. Anger explodes and disappears. Resentment stays, ferments, waits. And you can read resentment easily. It speaks in sarcasm, in passive aggression, in jokes that land just a little too sharp. Whenever someone says, "I'm just joking," but you feel oddly uncomfortable, congratulations, you've just met resentment. Nietzsche would say that people who feel powerless become experts at moral judgment. They can't control their lives, so they control narratives. They decide who is good, who is evil, who deserves punishment. This was especially popular among clergy, minor nobles, and court figures with no real authority. They couldn't wield swords, so they wielded shame. Which brings us to another truth. People who obsess over morality are often avoiding self-examination. Nietzsche didn't trust loud virtue. He found it suspicious. Because genuinely ethical people don't need an audience. But insecure people need applause. And if you ever meet someone who constantly announces how honest they are, well, you already know. Nietzsche also noticed that people project their fears onto others. The jealous accuse others of betrayal. The dishonest assume everyone lies. The cruel believe the world is cruel. Because imagining others are like you makes your behavior feel normal. This is one of the easiest ways to read someone. Listen to what they complain about most. That's usually what they're struggling with internally. A king obsessed with loyalty is often terrified of betrayal. A ruler obsessed with obedience is quietly unsure of his legitimacy. Nietzsche watched Europe collapse under the weight of fragile egos wearing crowns. And he noticed something else. People don't want truth. They want comfort. They say they want honesty, but only the kind that flatters them. Which is why uncomfortable truth-tellers are always unpopular, and popular leaders are rarely honest. This made Nietzsche deeply unpopular, which honestly checks out. He believed humans prefer illusions that protect their identity over truths that threaten it. And that's why people get angry not when you insult them, but when you describe them accurately. Because accuracy removes their mask, and humans love their masks. Let's drift gently into another truth. People reveal their priorities by what they sacrifice. Not what they claim to value, not what they post about, but what they give up time, health, relationships, and dignity for. Royal heirs sacrificed siblings, alliances, sometimes entire countries, not for duty, but for validation. Nietzsche believed the deepest human drive was not survival, but significance. To matter, to be seen, to leave a mark, even if that mark was destructive. And perhaps the most quietly unsettling truth of all, people don't change when they understand. They change when the pain of staying the same outweighs the fear of change. Which is why advice rarely works, and consequences always do. Nietzsche wasn't optimistic about humanity, but he was observant. And once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. You'll notice them in voices, in pauses, in what people avoid. And slowly, as your eyes grow heavy, you might even notice them in yourself, which, according to Nietzsche, was the hardest part, and the most important. Part 2. Power, Ego, and the Soft Sounds of Human Weakness. And so the mind keeps drifting. No sharp turns here, no sudden revelations, just a slow continuation, like walking down a long palace hallway at night, where every door hides another fragile human wearing something expensive. Nietzsche believed that power doesn't corrupt people, it reveals them, which was bad news for kings, and even worse news for emperors. Because once someone gains power, they no longer need to pretend as much. And pretending, as it turns out, is what keeps most people socially acceptable. When someone suddenly becomes powerful, watch closely. Do they become quieter or louder? Because insecurity, when given power, doesn't calm down. It panics. It starts over-controlling, over-punishing, over-explaining. History is filled with rulers who punished tiny insults with massive reactions, not because the insult mattered, but because it landed too close to the truth. Nietzsche noticed that people with fragile egos are hypersensitive to disrespect. They don't brush things off, they collect them. They remember names, dates, exact words, because their identity is constantly under threat. And the easiest way to read someone instantly is to see how they react when they don't get the respect they think they deserve. Secure people shrug, insecure people spiral. Another quiet truth. People don't want equality, they want superiority without responsibility. Which explains a lot.
Nietzsche watched revolutions replace kings with new elites who behaved exactly the same, just with different slogans. Because human nature didn't change, only the costumes did. He believed most people don't want freedom, they want relief from responsibility. Freedom requires decision-making, failure, self-blame. Much easier to follow rules and blame someone else, which is why people often admire strong leaders who make choices for them, not because those leaders are wise, but because they remove anxiety. If you ever want to read someone, ask yourself, do they want control or do they want to avoid accountability? Nietzsche believed that many moral systems were built not from wisdom, but from exhaustion. People who felt powerless declared power immoral. People who couldn't compete declared competition evil. And suddenly weakness became a virtue, not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. This doesn't mean strength is always good. Nietzsche wasn't that simple. He just noticed how often morality was shaped by personal limitation. Which brings us to another psychological truth. People disguise their desires as principles. A prince who wanted the throne called it destiny. A queen who wanted revenge called it justice. A courtier who wanted influence called it loyalty. Humans are remarkably good at rebranding their impulses. Nietzsche believed self-deception was the most advanced human skill, and it's usually invisible to the person doing it. You can read this easily by listening for moral language used to justify very personal outcomes. Whenever someone says, "It's not about me, it's about what's right," it's usually about them. Not always maliciously, often unconsciously. Another truth. People reveal their fears by what they try to control. A ruler obsessed with borders fears invasion. A parent obsessed with obedience fears chaos. A partner obsessed with loyalty fears abandonment. Control feels like safety to anxious minds. Nietzsche believed that trust was a luxury of inner strength. The more fragile someone feels, the tighter they grip. Which is why tyrants micromanage and confident leaders delegate. If you ever feel someone tightening rules around you, watch closely. They're not gaining confidence, they're losing it. Nietzsche also noticed that people hate mirrors, not literal ones, psychological ones. Anyone who reflects back an uncomfortable truth becomes an enemy, which is why truth-tellers were exiled, mocked, or quietly removed from court, and why flatterers thrived. People don't reward honesty, they reward emotional comfort, which makes honesty a very lonely profession. Another soft truth. People confuse being busy with being important. Kings held endless ceremonies, nobles obsessed over protocol, courts drowned in rituals, not because they mattered, but because emptiness is terrifying. Stillness forces self-reflection, and self-reflection is dangerous. Nietzsche believed humans prefer noise to avoid confronting themselves, which is why silence feels heavy to insecure people. Watch how uncomfortable someone becomes when conversation slows. They'll fill it, anything to avoid the void. And perhaps one of Nietzsche's most revealing observations, people don't envy success, they envy effortless success. Hard-earned victories can be admired, but natural talent? That feels unfair. Which is why gifted individuals are often resented quietly, not for what they do, but for what they didn't have to suffer through. In royal families, this played out constantly. The favored child, the charming heir, the naturally adored queen. Others smiled and waited, because resentment is patient, and resentment doesn't sleep. Nietzsche believed that people rarely forgive those who remind them of their limitations. which is why brilliance attracts hostility as often as admiration. If you ever wonder why someone dislikes you without reason, you might be the mirror they avoid. And slowly, as the night deepens, you start seeing these truths everywhere, in voices, in silences, in what people defend too quickly. And Nietzsche would quietly remind you, understanding human psychology doesn't make you superior, it makes you careful. Because once you see these patterns, you realize how easily you could fall into them too. And that realization is usually enough to keep the ego very quiet.
Part 3. Self-deception, comfort, and the gentle art of lying to yourself. The story keeps moving. Not quickly, not loudly, just drifting forward, the way thoughts do when you're almost asleep, but not quite ready to let go. Nietzsche spent a surprising amount of time thinking about lies. Not the dramatic kind, not conspiracies or grand betrayals, the small ones. The quiet lies people tell themselves so they can wake up each morning and feel fine. Because according to Nietzsche, most humans don't collapse under hardship. They collapse under honesty. So they cushion reality. They soften it. They round off the sharp edges. And this begins early. Royal children were taught who they were long before they had any idea who they actually were. You are chosen. You are special. You are destined. Which sounds comforting until reality disagrees. Nietzsche noticed that when identity is handed to someone rather than built, it becomes fragile. Any challenge feels like theft, which is why criticism hits so hard for people who never earned their self-image. They defend it desperately, because without it, there's nothing underneath. Another soft observation. People confuse familiarity with truth. If something is repeated often enough, especially by authority, it starts to feel real. Kings repeated myths of divine right. Nobles repeated family legends. Courts repeated flattering narratives. And eventually, they believed them. Nietzsche believed repetition was more powerful than evidence, which explains why false ideas can survive centuries if they're comforting enough. This is also why humans resist new perspectives. Not because they're wrong, but because they're unfamiliar. And unfamiliar feels dangerous. You can read someone easily by how they respond to ideas that challenge their worldview. Do they get curious or defensive? Curiosity suggests security. Defensiveness suggests fear. Another soft observation. People rarely hate others for what they do. They hate them for how they make them feel. Embarrassed, inferior, exposed. In royal courts, this led to quiet rivalries, subtle sabotage, and suspicious accidents. All very civilized, of course. Nietzsche believed humiliation was one of the strongest motivators in human behavior. People will forgive harm. They will forgive loss. But they rarely forgive being made to feel small. And the more public the humiliation, the deeper the wound. Which is why proud people are often the most dangerous when cornered. Not because they're cruel, but because they're terrified of losing face. Another truth floats by. People attach their identity to what they defend most loudly. A king obsessed with tradition is often afraid of change. A noble obsessed with honor is often hiding guilt. A moral crusader is often running from self-examination. Nietzsche noticed that the louder the defense, the weaker the foundation. Because truly grounded beliefs don't need protection. They just exist. This is why people argue not to discover truth, but to protect identity. Winning the argument matters less than preserving self-image. And losing feels unbearable when your ego is brittle. Another soft observation.
People prefer simple villains to complex realities. It's easier to blame than to understand, which is why history loves scapegoats. A failed policy becomes one person's fault. A collapsing empire becomes a single betrayal. Nietzsche believed humans simplify reality to avoid responsibility. Complex systems require humility. Scapegoats require outrage. Outrage feels productive. Understanding feels exhausting. So, outrage wins. And perhaps one of the most quietly revealing truths: people don't want to be seen fully. They want to be admired selectively. They curate themselves, edit themselves, present only the angles that feel safe. Which is why intimacy is rare. To be truly known means risking rejection, and most humans would rather be lonely than exposed. Nietzsche found this tragic. Not dramatic tragic, just quietly sad. Another truth drifts into view. People measure others by standards they secretly fear they cannot meet. The strict judge is often terrified of judgment. The harsh critic is often self-critical. The unforgiving moralist is often deeply ashamed. Projection isn't malicious, it's defensive. And once you see it, you hear it everywhere. Listen carefully to criticism. It often reveals more about the speaker than the target. Nietzsche also noticed that people cling to suffering if it gives them meaning. A painful identity is still an identity, which is why some people resist healing, because without their struggle, they wouldn't know who they are. This was common in royal figures whose lives lacked purpose beyond title. Suffering became personality, and personality became armor. Another soft realization: people don't fear death as much as they fear insignificance, to vanish unnoticed, unremembered. Which is why legacy-obsessed monarchs built monuments, wrote memoirs, and commissioned flattering portraits. Not because they loved art, but because they feared being forgotten. Nietzsche believed the hunger for legacy was deeply human, but also deeply exhausting, because no legacy ever feels complete. And finally, a truth that slips in quietly. People rarely seek happiness. They seek relief. Relief from anxiety, from uncertainty, from self-doubt. Comfortable lies provide relief. Uncomfortable truths demand growth, and growth is tiring. So most people choose comfort, not because they're weak, but because they're human. Nietzsche didn't judge this harshly. He just noticed it. And noticing changes how you listen, how you watch, how you move through the world with a little more caution and a little less illusion. And as your breathing slows and the thoughts soften, these truths don't shout. They just sit there, waiting to be noticed.
Part 4. Fear, Habit, and the Quiet Comfort of Staying the Same. And so the night keeps stretching. Nothing urgent, nothing sharp, just the slow unfolding of human behavior, the kind that repeats itself so often it almost feels natural. Nietzsche paid close attention to fear, not panic, not terror, the subtle kind, the kind that whispers, better not change this, better not risk that, better not look too closely. He noticed that most people don't live according to what they want. They live according to what they're afraid to lose: status, routine, approval. Which explains why miserable arrangements can last generations. Royal marriages stayed intact long after affection vanished. Traditions continued long after they stopped making sense. Not because anyone believed in them, but because breaking them felt risky. Nietzsche believed habit was stronger than desire. People don't need to be convinced to stay the same, they just need to be tired.
Another quiet truth. People interpret comfort as correctness. If something feels familiar, it feels right, even if it's harmful. Which is why abusive systems often feel normal to those raised inside them, and why change feels wrong even when it's necessary. You can read someone easily by watching how they react to disruption. Do they get curious or defensive? Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sighs. Another observation drifts in. People mistake routine for stability. Routines feel safe, predictable, manageable, but safety is not the same as growth. Nietzsche believed humans cling to routine because it reduces the burden of choice. Choices mean responsibility. Responsibility means blame. Much easier to say, this is just how things are. Kings followed precedent, courts followed tradition, families followed patterns, and nobody had to think too hard. Another soft realization. People admire courage but rarely practice it. They praise risk-takers from a safe distance, because courage looks inspiring until it's required. Nietzsche believed courage was the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite discomfort, which made it rare, because discomfort is persuasive. Another truth. People equate longevity with legitimacy. If it's lasted this long, it must be right, which is comforting and often wrong. Long-standing systems can be deeply flawed. They simply survived long enough to feel inevitable. Nietzsche found this amusing and a little sad, because survival does not equal wisdom. It just means no one stopped it. Another gentle observation. People fear isolation more than dishonesty. They'll suppress doubts, swallow discomfort, accept contradictions, all to remain included. Belonging is powerful, which is why dissenters are rare and conformists are common. Nietzsche believed most beliefs were social agreements, not personal conclusions, and you can read someone instantly by noticing whether they value truth or acceptance more. Another truth floats quietly past. People don't notice gradual decay. Slow changes feel invisible. Empires didn't collapse overnight, they eroded. Manners declined, standards softened, competence faded, and nobody panicked because each step felt small. Nietzsche believed decay was most dangerous when comfortable, when decline feels normal. Another soft truth. People romanticize the past when the present feels uncertain. Nostalgia isn't about history, it's about anxiety. A longing for simpler narratives, clearer roles, predictable outcomes. Which is why failing rulers often praised the good old days. Not because they were better, but because they were familiar. Another observation. People confuse endurance with virtue. Suffering through something is often praised as strength, but endurance can also be avoidance. Staying doesn't always mean courage. Sometimes it means fear of leaving. Nietzsche believed knowing when to walk away was a rare skill and deeply misunderstood. Another truth. People prefer explanations that absolve them. Fate, destiny, divine will, all very convenient. If something was inevitable, then no one is responsible. Nietzsche found this comforting narrative deeply appealing and deeply dishonest, because responsibility is heavy, and humans prefer lighter stories. And now, as the night settles deeper, you can see it everywhere. The habits, the fears, the quiet agreements people make with their own limitations. Nietzsche didn't hate humanity for this, he understood it, which made him patient and occasionally amused, Because once you see how fear shapes behavior, how habit becomes identity, how comfort disguises decay, reading people becomes effortless, not judgmental, just clear. And clarity at this hour feels strangely calming.
Part 5. Identity, illusion, and the soft weight of being someone. The night keeps going, uninterrupted, unconcerned with conclusions. Nietzsche would have liked that. He believed humans were less interested in truth than in being someone, an identity, a role, a story that makes sense when repeated enough times. Because drifting without a label feels unsettling. So people choose names for themselves. Loyal, strong, moral, practical, victim, leader. And once chosen, they defend those labels fiercely. Nietzsche noticed that identity often becomes a prison disguised as personality. People stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What would someone like me do?" Which is how flexibility disappears. Royal figures were especially trapped by this. A king could not be gentle, a queen could not be uncertain, an heir could not fail publicly. Not because it was impossible, but because it contradicted the story. And stories mattered more than reality. Another quiet truth. People mistake consistency for authenticity, but consistency can be forced. Rigid identities aren't always genuine, they're often defensive. Nietzsche believed the healthiest minds were adaptable. They changed, they evolved, they contradicted their past selves. And insecure people hated that, because change feels like betrayal to those who need certainty. You can read someone instantly by how they respond to contradiction. Do they allow growth, or do they feel threatened? Another soft observation. People attach moral value to what benefits them. A policy that helps becomes just. A rule that harms becomes unfair. Nietzsche believed objectivity was extremely rare. Most opinions are interests wearing ethical language, which is why debates feel endless. They're not about truth, they're about preservation. Another truth drifts in. People fear being ordinary more than being wrong. Ordinary feels invisible. Wrong can be corrected, which is why grand delusions often outlive small realities. Royal bloodlines exaggerated importance, titles inflated relevance, ceremonies amplified meaning. Not because they mattered, but because ordinariness was unbearable. Nietzsche believed humans would rather be flawed heroes than honest equals. Another observation. People prefer identities that excuse their failures. I'm just not that kind of person. I was born this way. That's just how I am. Comforting phrases, limiting ones. They turn temporary states into permanent ceilings. Nietzsche believed potential frightened people, because potential demands effort, and effort risks disappointment. Another truth. People confuse recognition with connection. Applause feels like belonging, but it's shallow. True connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability risks rejection. So many choose admiration instead. Kings stood before crowds and slept alone. Nietzsche found this quietly ironic. Another gentle realization. People curate their suffering. They highlight certain pains and hide others, not to deceive, but to maintain identity. Suffering becomes proof, evidence of depth, of importance. Nietzsche believed some people cling to suffering because it gives them narrative weight. Without it, they'd feel empty. Another truth floats softly by. People don't resist change because it's hard. They resist change because it threatens who they think they are. Change asks uncomfortable questions, and questions destabilize identity. So people protect the story at all costs. Another observation. People often admire strength but punish those who display it honestly.
Confidence without humility is called arrogance. Confidence with boundaries is called cold. Nietzsche noticed society preferred manageable strength, strong enough to admire, not strong enough to challenge. Another truth. People reveal their deepest values not in choices, but in sacrifices they refuse to make. What they won't give up tells you everything. Status, comfort, control, narrative. Nietzsche believed sacrifice was the truest expression of belief. Words were easy, loss was honest. And now, as the quiet stretches longer, you start to notice how identities settle, how illusions stabilize, how being someone slowly replaces being aware. Nietzsche didn't offer escape, he offered clarity. And clarity doesn't shout, it simply sits with you, patient, while the mind grows tired of pretending.
Part 6. Seeing clearly, living quietly, and the soft end of illusion. And now the night feels deeper. Not darker, just quieter. The kind of quiet where thoughts stop racing and begin to drift, one after another, without urgency. Nietzsche believed that truly understanding people didn't make life louder, it made it softer. Because once you see patterns clearly, you stop taking everything personally. You stop reacting to every word, every glance, every small provocation. You realize most behavior is not about you at all. It's about fear, habit, identity. And that realization is calming. One of Nietzsche's final psychological truths was that most people are not consciously dishonest. They are selectively aware. They notice what protects them and overlook what threatens them, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. Which is why arguments rarely change minds. New information has to pass through identity first, and identity has guards. Another quiet truth. People don't want to be understood. They want to be validated. Understanding can be uncomfortable. Validation feels warm. So when people share stories, they're often not asking for insight. They're asking for agreement. Nietzsche learned to listen without interrupting illusions, not because he believed them, but because shattering them rarely helped. Truth, he believed, had to be absorbed slowly, like this. Another observation. People who constantly seek certainty are often deeply anxious. Certainty promises safety, final answers, closed doors. But life doesn't work that way. Nietzsche believed uncertainty was the natural state of thinking minds, and those who couldn't tolerate it clung to rigid beliefs, not because they were strong, but because they were tired. Another truth drifts in. People reveal themselves most clearly in moments of comfort, not crisis, not stress, comfort. When defense is lower, when vigilance fades. Watch people when they feel safe. That's who they are. Another soft realization. People don't remember facts, they remember feelings, which is why emotional impressions outlive accurate details. Kings were remembered as cruel or kind, not efficient or inefficient. Nietzsche believed emotion was the true currency of memory, and understanding that lets you read history and people with the same lens. Another truth. People don't fear being alone. They fear being alone with themselves. Silence removes distractions, and distraction protects the ego, which is why solitude is avoided and sought at the same time. Nietzsche walked alone often, not because he disliked people, but because clarity required space. Another observation. People confuse acceptance with peace. Acceptance can be passive. Peace is active.
True peace comes from seeing reality clearly and choosing how to engage with it, not pretending it's different. Nietzsche didn't promise happiness, he promised awareness, and awareness, strangely enough, can be restful. Another truth floats softly past. People don't change all at once. They drift. They shift quietly, subtly. One belief loosens, one habit weakens, until one day they notice they're not the same. Nietzsche believed transformation was silent, not dramatic, which is why it's often missed. And finally, the last psychological truth. People are far more fragile than they appear, and far more resilient than they believe. They break easily and heal slowly. Understanding this makes judgment feel unnecessary and patience feel natural. Nietzsche didn't ask us to love humanity blindly. He asked us to see it clearly. And seeing clearly doesn't disturb the mind, it settles it. So as the night holds you and thoughts soften, there's nothing to solve, nothing to fix, just patterns observed, illusions loosened, and a quiet awareness that most of what people do makes sense once you understand what they're protecting. That understanding doesn't keep you awake, it lets you rest. And with that, we let the thoughts drift away, slowly, gently, just as they came.